SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome to the course An Introduction to Disability Studies. So, in this lecture I am going to talk about disability movements in India. In the previous lecture I was talking about disability history, history of disability in India. So, what are the major points that I was talking about? So, one of the important points that I was saying that most of the time what happens that we have borrowed the idea from the West, and those ideas that we have borrowed from the West are applied in our Indian culture. We tend to fail to understand that Indian culture are very different, Indian culture are very diverse, it is very dynamic, and for one understanding which is borrowed from the West are applied over the East, right. So, this is what I was speaking against it, and I was talking about that this idea must not be included. We must reject this very notion where people with disability are interpreted, people with disability are understood as if they are from the West, however, they are from India. As we all know that we are culturally produced, right? We are religiously produced, we are politically produced, which means to say that the very body which has a certain meaning, right, every parts of our body has a meaning, meaning is assigned to our bodies, and these bodies have a meaning, are interpreted in a culture the way meaning are attached to you. So, which means to say that the meaning which is from one culture may differ from another culture, right. So, what happens when we tend to misunderstand this fact and borrow the concept from the West or meaning and think in the same way about India. That is a one proposition I was speaking, and I was extremely against it. The second concern that I had is that why is it so that the moment we start talking about something in the West, immediately we start talking the same thing in East or in India. Let us say for example, I gave an example that environmental studies, eco studies was almost discussed, always debated in India, but people thought that no, in academic discourse this is missing, so let us bring it out. Why not India became the first one to talk about eco consciousness? Because the way it has importance of nature, no culture ever had or has still today. So, that is the second problem I had when I was thinking about it. The third problem I had is that the way we are interpreting, the way we are thinking about our Indian myths, Indian history, Indian culture, right. Most of the time as I was talking about that, I was discussing that Draupadi, Manthara, Dhritarashtra, these are the examples are borrowed, and we tend to think that these people were discriminated, not liked by society because of their body. But you see that when we are selecting something, this very selection, the very process of selection, very process of choosing something, like when you choose something, when you choose a color, when you choose a character, when you choose a novel, you have certain idea behind choosing something, right. So, this very idea behind of choosing specific characters and proving that look at the culture are the characters in the Indian myths where people were discriminated is because they want to prove that Indian culture did not respect disabled people. That is what I am dead against it. Is because this very selection is a biased one. If we really want to bring the true notion of people with disabilities, we are going to talk about other culture as well in India that exist and other characters which are very much available in India, and you see that in these myths and these Indian text, they were given the due importance because of their disability as well. So, what I spoke about, when we talk about Dhritarashtra, we forget to talk about that his disability was not the reason for his discrimination, right. It is his evil deed that was responsible for his discrimination. Same case about the Manthara and other, but Ashtavakra, the Shravan's parents, there are many examples who are still revered, who are still accepted and promoted in our society despite of their differences, despite of their disabilities, right. So, what I am saying, what I am arguing, that when you are looking at the cultural interpretations, make sure that you are not biased, you are not prejudiced, you are not highly influenced by the Western academic culture, and think about India in the same way. Third point I was talking about, that even we discuss about Indian Hindu religion, we discuss about the Muslim religion, and we also discuss about the Christian religion. And in all these three religions, we noticed, we saw, we understood that they all are talking about humanity, empathy, love, emotions, respect. What does this mean? It shows that even Jesus, Prophet Muhammad, and even in Hindu religions, these people served humanity with love, emotions, care and concern, right. These people served humanity with love, care, emotions and concern, because the people can look at them and think that yes, that is how they are, they must also treat people with disability or every human being with emotions and empathy. So, here you see that most of the religions were not discriminatory. Obviously, when I was talking about the Christian beliefs, I was talking about the Old Testament was a different, but in New Testament Jesus treated everyone equally, right. So, this is also I made a point that how you look at the different religion, they all are treating everyone equally, they are giving respect, they are paying respect, there are no difference, there is no discrimination because of the body, right. Indian society was most based on deed, not based on birth. Obviously, then also be looked at that how when the Western education came into Indian society, or when Macaulay's Minute came into society, Hunter Commission came in India, how the colonization started disrupting Indian myths and cultures and started producing English as a morality and intellect for Indians. So, people do not look at disability the way it existed, but how it was produced by the West. That is how we started looking at the disability. And obviously, I also made one important point in the previous lecture is this, that in every culture, in every religion, even if you are going from northeast to the south or west or anywhere, if you go in any part, we have a 22 official language, and all these 22 official languages have a different meaning for disabled people. Why is it so? That we apply only one meaning that we have borrowed from the West, and we tend to ignore the meaning that is inculcated, that is cultured, that is accepted, that is promoted, that is spoken by people of India, right. So, these are the important points that I was making. These are the important concern that I was making in the previous lecture. I also talked about the Indian population, but obviously, I am going to talk more in details about this in this lecture, which is titled as Disability Movements in India. Now, the question you need to ask is that why in this lecture I am talking about disability movement in India. I am talking about this lecture of disability movement in India because previous lecture was talking about history of disability in India. In India, disability studies became part of academic culture, obviously because of the people who were indulged in and concerned about disability, and they started noticing that how this discourse of disability can enrich other disciplines as well, and how this discipline can make people conscious about the body marked with differences and they can be educated, because the purpose of teaching is educating. Educating does not always mean employment. Obviously, now in the narrow sense, it has become that you are teaching someone so that they can be employed, but it goes to one step ahead, bringing the consciousness, elevating their consciousness. Developing critical thinking is the job of humanities and social sciences, or the job of universities. So, therefore, what we saw, that certain movements started taking place, certain awareness started walking in Indian public spaces, and they started advocating and talking about the concern associated with people with disabilities. They could see that how the rights of people with disabilities are ignored. They could notice that how the rights of disability people are not into the place, and that is why in the last lecture you remember that I was talking about the act that came into 1995. It is trying to give us a sense of justice. It is trying to give us a sense of inclusion. It tries to give a sense of so that we can have employment opportunities. It is trying to give a sense that okay, we are also human. So, this is an attempt made by the legal constitutions and principles policy makers, and that was all not possible if certain movements might have not taken place. So, this is why it is very important and extremely relevant to understand that there is a disability movement which are responsible for promoting of the inclusion. Obviously, there are many NGOs which are also working, there are many think tanks, they are also working, there are many scholars, they are also working, there are many people are also working. So, they all are working towards the promotion of inclusion, a kind of inclusivity for people with disabilities, right. So, these are the important points we need to keep in mind when we are going to talk about disability movements in India. Second question, before we go back to the slides, let me ask you that why is it important to talk about disability movements? Let me talk about what Anita Ghai has to say. Anita Ghai is talking about an excluded agenda of a feminism. There is an article she wrote in which she talked about the feminist disability scholars. They started talking about the concern associated with women, but they tend to ignore disabled women, as if disabled women are not women. Why is it so? Why is it so when there is a feminist scholars are talking about concern associated with women, they are ignoring disabled women? Because one, there is a possibility they think that they are not one of us. They are disabled, we are not disabled. They are different from us, right. That is one idea. The second point is that they are not being discussed and debated for a very particular reason, that let us first talk about our concern, then later on we can discuss about, because these two are different issues, we should not mix it up. But remember that disabled women and women, as I discussed, that Aristotle talked about women as a mutilated women, right, mutilated body, which means to say women itself is a disabled. Obviously, I discuss about this very extensively in the lecture called Gender, Body and Sexuality. But the point what I am talking about, that there are certain movements started taking place, they all are talking about marginal identity, but they never included disability, because for them they thought that disability is not important phenomena. Disability is not one of us. Disability is not a very important part. And if we talk about disability, we will miss our concern. But when disability studies talk, when disability movement starts, it takes everyone together, every marginal identity together, because for disability studies, it is not only about people with disabilities, it is about every marginal identity. All right. So, this keeping in the mind, I am going to look at the slide number one. Look at the slide please. In the late 1970s and 80s, within the South Asian context, women's movement and environmental movement emerged as a pioneering forces, right. They sought to highlight, just a second, look at this slide please. They sought to highlight the underlying structural causes of gender inequalities and environmental degradation, right. These movements viewed these issues as a frameworks for understanding the erosion of dignified living standards and living opportunities in developing nations. So, look at the time. It's 1970s and 1980s, when in the South Asian there are two movements started. The one is women's movement and the second one is environmental movements. Right? These two movements started. Why these two movements started? Because South Asian societies started realizing that environmental damage is being done in our societies and no one is taking this into the consideration, and which will lead to destruction of humanities, right. Because I am sure that you will see the policies on the world level, they are more biased towards South Asian nations, right, and they are more concerned towards their own countries rather than talking about the South Asian culture and nature. So, what we are realizing that environmental concerns became one important factor in the 1970s and 1980s because of the environmental degradation in our societies, deforestations. Right, Bandana Siva talks more about the environment and ecological concern. I would suggest you to read more on it so that you can understand. And the second is about the women's movement. Why women movement started taking place in 1970s, 1980s? Because this is the time when women realize that they are not getting full identity. Their identity is damaged. They are something else, but they are being represented as something else, all right. But even the history of women are very rich in Indian context. I mean, there are certain evil problem that we had in ancient societies, or let us say before colonization, but there are many good consideration, there are many good things existed in our ancient medieval societies, right. But let us, I am not going to talk about this women's movement and environmental movement, but my concern is that I am asking a question is that why these two movements started taking place in 1970s and 1980s, right. The one is talking about gender inequality, women's movement, and one is talking about environmental degradations. Now, my question is this, why not before and not later, right. So, here you see that these movement started for a very reason, so that they can get the dignified living standards and the livelihood opportunities in the developing nations. So, in the developing nations they are extremely expecting what about our rights, what about the opportunities that we deserve. And imagine this is starting in 1970s and 1980s. And what about the act which came for the rights of people with disabilities? You remember in the previous class, 1995. Look at this, how late disability rights are being given to people with disabilities. 1970s, 1980s, where people are started demanding for nature concern and women's inequalities should be erased. But it is 1995 when people are showing the concern for disability. But one idea is also this, that had these movements, which movements? Feminist movement and environmental movements not started, I do not see that disability movement would have also started. Because what happens? You need a room and a space to think like that, all right. You need to get a time and opportunities to think like that. So, I am just making this idea that these movements, which is, let us say, environmental movements and the feminist movement, also gave a hint for disabled scholar or people with disabilities to talk about their rights as well, right. Look at the slide, please, right. I am putting an emphasis here because this is a point of thinking, right. You see, think about this, that 1970s, 1980s, 1970s time for female, 1980s nature, and this is the time where disability, right. So, these movement viewed these issues as a framework for understanding the erosion of dignified living standard and livelihood opportunities in developing nations. So, theoretical shift during this period moved away from systematic analysis towards a focus on individual actors and agency, right. So, there is a theoretical shift in this period that is moving from a systematic analysis towards a focus on individual actor and agency. This shift aimed to provide alternative perspective that connected macro level structure with macro level processes, placing greater importance on understanding of the lived experience of everyday life. So, the point what I was talking about, that now they are not saying that I am doing something good for everyone, because what happens in that case, when you are talking about every humanities, obviously there are certain notions which are applicable for all, but let us say for example, there are certain benefits which are only enjoyed by certain majorities. So, what would happen for other section of the society, where would they go, right. So, now the point is that these movements are talking about individual agencies, these movements are concerned about the individual framework, they are talking about what about us. So, no more about the entire human beings, because when you are concerned and talking about the entire human beings, it is only the upper class caste men are getting benefit out of it. So, this is what it means about individual agency, individual ideas, individual identity. Where is our space? Fine, there is a good society, people are having good time. What about us? What about our identity? Where is our people? Why are they missing in this larger picture? Right. So, the point is made that now there is a greater importance on understanding of the lived experience of everyday life. Everyday life, which means once you get up in the morning till you go to the bed, and even during the bed, everything, where is our life and agencies. These are sexual agency becomes one of the important concern in feminist disability studies, right, which I already discussed and talked about it. So, this is what these thinkers are doing and these movements are taking shape. Look at the next slide, please. The advent of postmodern and post-structuralist influences in the 1990s shifted the discourse towards embracing difference and fueled the rise of identity politics. This era, often associated with globalization, saw a reorientation towards acknowledging and embracing diverse identities and perspectives. Look at this idea before I get into this. See, one of thing I would like to say that without post-structuralist understanding and without postmodern thinking, it is really impossible and difficult to understand all the perspectives and ideas. Why I am talking about post-structuralist and postmodern is because these discourses also helped post-colonial studies, subaltern studies, Dalit studies, feminist studies, caste studies, right, environmental studies, green studies, disability studies, to shape their discourses and ideas differently. Because of the postmodern and post-structuralist discourses, identity politics came into the picture. And now, everyone started talking about different discourses which is concerned with the differences, right. Because you remember what postmodern does, it talks about that it debunks the very hierarchy of high culture versus low culture. It challenges the very notion what to consider as a high culture or what to consider as a low culture, and with the help of post-structuralist framework, postmodern thinkers proves that there is nothing called high and low culture at all. It is a classical way to promote certain ideas and thinking and to maintain the status quo. So, the politics of maintaining the status quo is responsible for not letting other culture to be legitimized, or other differences, other political differences, other existence coming into the same. Right? This is a problem they are talking about. Right? This is the concern they are raising. So, the postmodern and post-structuralist politics, when they started coming into the same, they started talking about the individual agency. They started talking about the body marked with differences. They started talking about the politics. They started acknowledging that what about the body that we have? What about that perspective that we have? Let us not cover everyone with one perspective. Let us not talk about the body from a one point of view and think that every body is alike. That is not true. That is not at all acceptable. So, identity politics is fueled by post-structuralist and postmodern thinking, and they started making a point that it is the case of identity politics where every identity is different from other identities. Do not say that we all are a human, just say that we are men, we are women, say that we are abled, we are disabled, because the moment you say human, what is the very idea of a human? Where does the idea of a human come from? It is more Western. What about Indian? The idea of being human as an Indian, because let us say for example, if you go to the West and you are not working the way they want, they will say, oh, you are not human anymore, you are not working like this. But in India, certain societies, if you are working hard every day and night, they will say, oh, you are working like an animal, not human. Human needs rest, right? Human enjoys rest, human take rest, they give time to the family. They talk about emotions, they are not very always so called dependent on their intellectuality. There is a human emotion that connect to each other in Indian societies. But the moment you say the discourse of human, we always talk about from the perspective of Western one. What about the Indian one? The very definition and the notion of being human is different from the West to the East. This idea could only emerge because of postmodernist and post-structuralist perspective. Had these ideas, had these two different discourses would have not come forward, people would have not, maybe people would have not thought about it. You got this idea, right? So, that is why now it is talking about that every identity is different from each other. Every identity is dynamically opposite to each other. Every identity has a different concern for each other. Every identity has a different say to say. Every identity feels differently, right? But if you are going to say that everyone has the one identity, now what would happen? That there are many sections of the society, there are many people, they are going to be discriminated and will not enjoy agency or rights, right. So, this is why there is a problem with assimilation, appropriation, homogenization or hegemonization, right. So, because of the globalization, what is happening also that there are a lot of identities are being confluenced. But what does it do? That even in the globalization, to escape from the horror of a globalization, it is important to talk about the identity discourses. Then only it is possible that we can speak about our rights and agencies. All right. So, with this I would move to the next slide now. Look at the next slide. During the late 1970s and 1980s, there was a notable rise in the establishment of non-government organization addressing livelihood and development concerns, alongside women's groups focusing on combating violence against women. Right? Concurrently, universities introduced women's studies programs and development studies courses covering a broad spectrum of issues ranging from economics and politics to health and the pursuit of equal and dignified lives. In contrast, Dalit concerns began to gain significant traction in the late 1980s and further consolidated their influence in the 1990s. This period witnessed the Dalit movement's transition towards political mobilization, particularly on issues related to reservation policies. This shift facilitated the development of political constituencies and reshaped the trajectory of Dalit movements. Additionally, academic engagement were redirected towards acquiring political representation on an international forum, especially concerning caste related issues. So, today anti-caste articulations have emerged as a pivotal discourse in South Asia, highlighting the pressing need for addressing caste based discrimination and advocating for social justice. So, this slide is more talking about that how after 1970s, 1980s, wherever women studies are talking about their concern about their rights, in the 1990s, anti-caste studies is also coming into the existence, where they are talking about reservation, they are talking about the problem associated with the caste, they are also talking about the politics. But see, what is the concern of these slides, the slide that I had showed to you? The concern of this slide is you to reflect upon that why is it so that India got independence in 1947, right, and obviously constitution came into place in 1950s, right, and later on we saw that almost 40 decades passed, 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Why is it so that 1990s become a movement, right? It become a movement where many movements are emerging. Obviously, 1970s, 1980s we saw environmental politics and movements, women's politics and movements, and then we have also in 1995 there is an act passed talking about disability rights, and then 1990s we also see people are talking about Dalit studies or anti-caste discrimination problems, right, and they are also raising the voices. So, in fact, if you Google and if you go to the South Ganga or if you look at the university's library, you will see that there are many theories are being produced during that time about those rights, about their agencies, about their problems associated, studies being done, so on and so forth. But still today, right, again there are 3 decades have almost passed, right, 2010, 20, now we are living in 2024, right. So, these 3 decades have passed, but still you see that the problem exists, right. Still you notice that the problem have a concern and they are being talked and discussed about it. Why is it so, right. So, look at the slide please again. So, the shift facilitated, look at this point, that is a very important point I am making here. Look at the slide please. The shift facilitated the development of political constituencies and reshaped the trajectory of Dalit movements. So, additionally, as I see that there are 2 things, right, one is a civic culture and another one I say academic culture, right. So, now what is happening in academic engagement were redirected towards acquiring political representation on an international platform, especially concerning caste related issues, right. So, there is a pivotal discourse emerging for advocating for social justice. So, now comes to we are coming to disability rights activism, right. So, we saw the movements started from 1970s, feminist movement we saw, 1980s we saw environmental, right, let us say environmentalist movements, and here we saw feminist movements, and then we are coming to 1990s, where we are going to talk about disability movements, right. So, in this evolving landscape, disability rights activism emerged, giving voice to individuals with disabilities whose voice had been marginalized until the early 1990s, right. The complexity and diversity inherent in disability issues contributed to the delayed collective expression of PWD, which means people with disabilities, right, which means people with disabilities. So, this complexity and diversity inherent in disability issues contributed to the delayed collective expression of PWD. That is the one reason I am raising here, that why disability movement started in 1990s. Unlike other marginalized groups, PWD encompass a wide range of diversity, cutting across race, caste and class divisions, making it challenging from cohesive advocacy groups. So, over 70s of PWD, let's talk about it before I come to this part, right. So, the point this is raised that 1990s is talking about disability movements. The very late emergence is also because of the complexities it has, right. I mean, the very idea who is disabled, what form of disability you have, what percentage of disability you have, whether it is a natural or cultural, what are the experiences that you have, right. Women can also be disabled, someone XYZ can also be disabled, so on and so forth, people can also be disabled. So, these people are going to be part of disability culture. So, that is the complexity, that is because of the reasons that most of the time people realize that, oh, that is going to be challenging, that is going to be more threatening, that is going to be more problematic. So, maybe it was delayed for these particular reason, the kind of this, right. How you are going to talk about who is disabled, like in every caste, in every class, in every gender, there is a disability availability, right. There is disability availability. So, how you are going to speak about it, think about it, right. So, this is what like PWD encompasses a wide range of diversity, race, caste, class, divisions, right, and at the same time disability within disability, like what forms of disability. There is a possibility that someone have a multiple forms of disability, right. Someone may have a different kind of a disability, or someone may have a double disability. What about that, right. So, this is what it is talking about, that how complex, how diverse, how rich disability is. Look at the point please, look at the slide please. Over 17% of PWD reside in rural areas, where information about their right is scarce. The Indian state's approach to disability was primarily influenced by medical, charity and religious model, viewing PWD as dependents reliant on state provisions. Formal employment opportunities for PWD were seldom considered, with families and communities expected to bear the responsibility for their care. This perception mirrored the broader societal attitudes towards women's work, often overlooked and excluded from GDP calculation. Traditional beliefs such as theory of karma and familial ideologies, coupled with charitable and pity-driven attitudes, shaped societal perception of PWD and informed state policies towards them. So, here the point what I am talking about, that why, the first question that I am going to ask is, why 70% population live in rural areas? However, people are moving from rural to urban cities, people are going over there, right. The one reason is obviously that city was not very inclusive for people with disabilities, right. Again, I am not saying that rural areas were very inclusive, but you move to a city, you go for job opportunities and employment, when one, there is availability of opportunities or employment opportunities available, or when you also see that the city is more accessible mentally, culturally, politically, in every terms when it is accessible to you, right. When it is accessible to you, then you feel like moving there. So, that is why you remember 70% of PWD people live in rural areas. And obviously, it also becomes one important reason that even if a state is doing something for them, even if a state is trying to push the policies and opportunities for them, it becomes extremely difficult to make them aware about it, because you know that we always struggle with the implementations, because India is a very diverse, very difficult, complex country. The population is huge and we need more resources, more people to work on the ground labor, and because of multiple problems individual have, they are not able to focus properly. And also the kind of wages or a kind of remunerations they get is very less, which does not give them incentive to work very inclusively in those spaces. So, that becomes one important reason that why we see that people with disabilities are still deprived. Most of the often I have noticed that people are not even aware that they are getting that kind of facilities in the societies, right. So, they are not getting these kind of facilities, and that is becoming one important reason for them being deprived of the basic rights. The one reason why 70% population not moving to the cities where there are opportunities and education and promotion of like they can get more money is possible, because of, as I said, attitudes and inaccessibility. And the second, as I also talking about, that there are people who are still feeling deprived, because the things are not being implemented systematically and properly, despite the effort made by law, state and also the ground workers. So, which means to say that we have to put the more work. But one thing also what we need to see, that if a large number of people are missing to who can contribute in the economy of the country, do you think that economy will boom? Because if a certain section of society, a certain percentage of a population who can work in booming the GDP or GNP of country, if they are not working on anything, what would happen, right? They will remain aloof, they will remain outside, and things will not be, even country will not go forward. So, that is why it is both ways. It is not only that people with disability need states, it is also state need people with disability. So, it is a reciprocate, they need to reciprocate with each other, so that they can also promote economy of a country, and country can also promote their needs, their rights, so on and so forth, which are deprived of them, right. So, this is and also because they have to also work on the social prejudices, right. Like I have been talking about in the previous class, that how people with disability were thought as if they are part of they are facing the punishment because of their past karma, its distributions, or so on and so forth goes on with their life. So, there are a lot of things attached to their body which has to be worked and reworked. All right, let us go to the next slide. So, in 1980s, it marked a significant policy shift from welfare oriented approach to development focus strategies. Think about it, right. Representing a pivotal phase where individuals with disabilities were recognized not merely as a recipient, but as an active participant in the development process. So, the decade of disabled persons brought about another, like this idea 1983 to 1992, right. This is a time when a lot of things are happening, right? A lot of things are working. It brought about another notable transition in the discourse of surrounding rehabilitation goals. During this period, there was increased engagement and involvement of international NGOs, alongside the emergence of local NGOs forming partnership with government to address disability issues at the grassroots level. So, you remember that this 1980s is shifting from welfare oriented approach to development focus. So, the rise of disability movements in late 1980s and 1990s was influenced by several factors. First, there was a noticeable shift towards more accountable state policies, alongside the active presence of women's movement advocating for broader social justice. Additionally, the interest and support of international agencies playing a significant role, creating an environmental conducive to the political mobilization of marginalized group like individual with disabilities, right. So, this phenomena, this era 1983 to 1992 is extremely significant. We need to go and see what were happening at that point of times. So, what is the welfare? Welfare means you are given this, you are given that policies, you are given that benefits, and that is it. The state is not responsible for anything else, which means to say, I have given you the reservation, I have given you the job, reservation in the job, reservation in the educations. Now, you go and find this out. I am no more responsible, I did my job. That is where disability movement started working more at the groundwork level. Who will make them aware that they have these facilities? And even if you have given the education, there is a percentage of reservation in the education, how are they going to get education? If they are suffering from the poverty, who will bear their educational cost or expenses? How are they going to come and access the building which is inaccessible? And if it is inaccessible, doesn't it simply mean that you do not want them to be included? If it is inaccessible, even if you give 10, 15, 20, 30, whatever percentage of a benefit. Let us say for example, I am sitting on the 4th floor and I am saying that I am going to give you food, money and clothes, and you come and get it from me. I am sitting on the 4th floor and which the building has no ramp. It has stairs. How do you think the person who does not have a leg is going to come and get the benefit out of it? That is the question, and think for a second. You can hold on a video and think about this point. How this person is going to get the food and money and clothes from a person who is sitting on the 4th floor and is saying that I am giving you all, why do not you come and get it from me? Do not you think that it is a kind of a discriminatory attitude where you think that even if I give, they are not going to enjoy it? And that is why disability movement, people associated with disability movement started more working on the ground level, telling the people or making the state responsible for having that discriminatory attitude. That why not state like buildings of the education institutions are more accessible? Why not you are making it more accurate and specific for everyone? Why not you are also working to implement it so that this benefit is enjoyed by people with disabilities, right? Why not this benefit is enjoyed by people with disabilities? Think about it for a second, right? So, these are the important concern that this slide is raising. Look at the next point please. So, additionally, the interest and support of international agencies played a significant role creating an environment conducive to the political mobilization of marginalized group like individual with disabilities. The enactment of person with disabilities, Equal Opportunities, Protection of Right and Full Participation Act can be largely attributed to international pressure rather than domestic lobbying effort or protest by disability rights group, right. So, a comparison with disability rights movement in the West highlights the comparatively shorter and less arduous struggle in India for legislative amendments. So, during this period, disabled activists in India formed groups to assert their political, legal and social rights, adopting a right-based approach. The 1990s, I have already explained this, I have already talked about this, I have told you these points. I am just asking you to look at the slides so that you can understand the points. So, the 1990s witnessed the impact of globalization on disability rights movement in India, characterized by increased international influences, stronger local NGO participation and enhanced accessibility to funding. This era also saw greater opportunities for networking and faster dissemination of information through the internet, shaping the trajectory of disability right activism in the Indian context. So, which means to say this 1990s was extremely influential in shaping, in creating a new life for people with disabilities. This 1990s became a very transitional period for upliftment of people with disability. It does not mean that now everything is fair and good. It only means that this time at least it started doing something for people with disabilities, right. Look at the slides again please. So, until the 1990s, disability rights group predominantly consisted of individuals and organizations representing physical disabilities. So, while those with mental and developmental disabilities were often overlooked, this oversight stemmed from the perception that mental and development impairment required specialized attention primarily within the medical framework. So, now here I have jotted down a lot of important points which I will read for you and you also read along with me. Because these are nothing to be explained, these are just important act which you need to know. So, during this period many NGOs, particularly those established by families or parents of people with intellectual disabilities emerged, right. So, now what is happening? There are concern for intellectual disability as well. Initially, it was mainly much oriented towards people with disabilities, physically handicapped people. Now, it is moving towards mentally disabled concern, right. So, look at the slide please. This organization advocated for regulatory measures to address the specific need of individuals with developmental disabilities. Notably, their efforts culminated in the passage of National Trust for Welfare of Persons with Disabilities, Autism, Cerebral Palsies, Mental Retardation and Multiple Disability Act in 1990s. This legislation specifically addresses issues pertaining to persons with developmental disabilities, marking a significant milestone in recognizing and addressing their rights and needs. The NCPEDP, which is called National Center for Promotion of Employment for Disabled People, that is very much based in Delhi. So, I will say the abbreviation NCPEDP has utilized the Person with Disability Act of 1995 as a benchmark and has advocated for its more effective implementation. They have emphasized the need for more comprehensive disability statistics program details and extent of scheme coverage through the publication of shadow report. The Disability Act places equal opportunity for individuals with disabilities and mandates a 3% reservation for them in job placement. However, the NCPEDP has criticized governmental annual report for their lack of information regarding the implementation status of this reservation policies in government positions. So, additionally, recent concerns have been raised regarding employment opportunities for people with disabilities in the private sector. So, particularly sectors such as business process outsourcing, that is called BPO, right, business process outsourcing, information technologies have been identified as having significant potential for employing persons with disabilities. However, challenges persist in ensuring their meaningful inclusion and participation. That is important point, right. So, in India, disability services are primarily administered by the government, but there is also a significant presence of NGOs, particularly in rural areas. Among urban squatter communities, NGOs play a pivotal role in facilitating the formation of organizations comprising disabled people and parents at the grassroots level. They are actively involved in community rehabilitation programs, often supported by government agencies and international organizations. So, these collective efforts over the past 2 decades have contributed to the popularization of philosophy of community based rehabilitation and have instilled hope among millions of people with disabilities. But there are critique. They argue that community based rehabilitation, the way it is being practiced in India, reflect the biases of urban educated social activists and funding agencies. So, initiators of CBR projects, community based rehabilitation, tend to maintain a distance from religious institutions and traditional organizations, because they look at religion as incompatible with their goals, which are aligned with medical and scientific frameworks. So, community based rehabilitation, it emphasizes activities such as needs assessment, long term planning, budgeting, record keeping, outcome evaluations. But again, these practices are often perceived as alien and incompatible with informal functioning of village communities, right. So, these are the point which I am explaining to you, so that you can understand that there are movements, there are initiatives are being taken, like they are working constantly, but still there are people who are deprived, still there are people who are not getting rights, still there are people who are not able to enjoy this, and there are people who are biased towards rural communities. The urban people, elite people, or who are educated, they can get benefit, but what about the concern, what about the rural people, what about those communities or those people who are living in not urban side, but rural side, right. So, these are the slides, look at the slide please. These are the slides where I am raising constantly these concerns, right. So, you can like stop the video and read the slides, all talking about that how certain initiative has a problem and what are the problems can be addresses, at what level they can be addresses, or what are the distinction we can make to understand. So, age is a significant factor that has been disregarded in discussion within the activist community. So, many activists are relatively young or middle aged and come from affluent background, right. So, that is why poor, rural are missing in the picture. This demographic profile often obscures the complex realities of identities formation and personhood within diverse Indian context. So, the disability rights movement in India is still striving to make its mark in the public sphere. However, it has undeniably made a significant impact on the lives of countless individuals with disabilities, advocating for more inclusive and accommodative environment throughout the country. So, every movement, every policies, every activism had some good points, some benefits it made, but it also lacked something. So, we need to work on that as well, so that we can promote an inclusive society. So, with this I would take a break and see you in the next class with the next discourse. Till then, I will say bye bye, take care, stay happy and healthy. Thank you so much for listening and paying your attention to me. Thank you.